It was a warm summer morning in 2008 when the small town of Prescott, Arizona, was shaken by an unsettling call. The call, made by a neighbor, reported the disappearance of 50-year-old Carol Kennedy. Carol, once married to Stephen DeMacher, had become a familiar face in the community. She was known for her quiet demeanor, but on this particular morning, something felt off. Carol's car was parked in the driveway, a detail that caught the attention of the responding officers. The vehicle, an older model sedan, was usually parked in the same spot every day, just outside the front door of her house. But there were no signs of life, no movement. The house, located on a quiet suburban street, was eerily still. When police arrived at the house, they noted the front door was unlocked, something Carol never did. She had always been meticulous about locking up. They stepped inside cautiously, expecting to find signs of a break-in, a struggle, something that might explain the apparent disappearance. But to their surprise, the house appeared undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no furniture knocked over, and nothing was missing. Yet something was amiss. The most alarming discovery was Carol's phone, which sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Her phone, that simple object left behind, was the first piece of the puzzle. No one had heard from her since the day before, and now, with her phone abandoned like that, the mystery deepened. Was she in danger? Did she leave in a hurry? Or was something more sinister at play? The officers searched the house thoroughly, inspecting every room, every nook and cranny. But the house told a story of a life paused, not a life taken. There were no bloodstains, no signs of physical harm, only the strange absence of Carol herself. The investigation was launched, and officers began by questioning those who knew Carol. Her friends and neighbors had little to report. Carol had been a quiet woman, friendly but reserved. No one had noticed any unusual behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Her ex-husband, Stephen DeMacher, however, was another matter entirely. DeMacher had been a constant presence in Carol's life after their divorce. They had been married for years and had 2 children, but their relationship had soured in the years leading up to their separation. The divorce had been messy, and DeMacher had not taken it well. He was angry about the alimony payments he had to make to Carol. The monthly sum of $6,000 was a significant burden for him, considering his financial situation had been deteriorating in recent years. There had been friction. Subtle at first, but over time, it grew more apparent. There were heated arguments over the phone, threats made in moments of anger. Carol had confided in her friends about the difficulties she faced with Stephen, and there were even rumors of him showing up uninvited at her home. But nothing concrete ever came from those rumors. So, when DeMacher's name surfaced in the early stages of the investigation, it wasn't surprising. But at that point, there was no direct evidence linking him to her disappearance. It was just a suspicion, an unsettling hunch. Still, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. The fact that Carol's car was still in the driveway seemed like an odd detail to them. If she had left on her own, why would she leave her car behind? It didn't add up. As the investigation progressed, the police turned to the phone records. They discovered that Carol had been in contact with her mother just hours before she was last seen. A phone call had taken place late the previous evening, and Carol had sounded upset. Her mother recalled that Carol had mentioned she planned to consult a lawyer about the alimony payments, which had become a source of constant stress for her. But it was the final words of the conversation that raised red flags. Carol had said, "I'll call you back in a bit. I need to deal with something." The call abruptly ended. The last words her mother heard before the phone went silent were, "Oh no." The line went dead after that. The detectives weren't sure what that meant, but it was clear that something had gone wrong. What was Carol about to deal with? Had she known something was about to happen? Was someone in her life pushing her to the edge? These questions lingered as the investigators tried to piece together the few remaining clues. Meanwhile, the house where Carol had lived alone for several years stood untouched, like an eerie monument to her absence. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no bloodstains, yet the house didn't feel empty. It felt paused, like something was missing, something crucial. The police were left with no physical evidence pointing to foul play, but the sense of danger was palpable. The investigation was just beginning, and although they had no clear answers yet, there was one thing the detectives knew for sure. Carol Kennedy was not just missing. Something had happened to her, and it was up to them to uncover the truth. The investigation into Carol Kennedy's disappearance was far from straightforward. As the first day passed without any major breakthroughs, the lead investigators began to piece together the fragments of her life, trying to understand what might have led to this seemingly sudden event, and in doing so, they uncovered details that pointed to a much deeper, darker story. Carol Kennedy was not just another name on the list of missing persons. Her life was woven with the threads of a complicated, sometimes painful history. At 50 years old, Carol had lived through the ups and downs of a difficult marriage, one that had ultimately ended in a bitter divorce. The relationship between Carol and her ex-husband, Stephen DeMacher, had been one of many contradictions: love and hate, affection and anger. Their marriage had lasted for years, but the toll it took on both of them was evident in the years leading up to their separation. DeMacher was not a man who had been satisfied with his life. Once a successful stockbroker, he had watched his career falter, his financial situation deteriorate, and his personal life crumble. The divorce had hit him hard, both emotionally and financially. Carol had been awarded a generous alimony settlement, $6,000 a month. This was not just a sum that DeMacher resented, it was a sum that seemed to define his misery. He had no choice but to pay it. But the weight of the payments loomed over him every month. What was once a relationship built on mutual love had turned into a transactional nightmare. The police began to investigate DeMacher's life in greater detail. They learned that, in the months leading up to Carol's disappearance, he had become increasingly frustrated with the divorce settlement. Friends and acquaintances reported that DeMacher often complained about the alimony, even suggesting that he was finding it difficult to keep up with the payments. His life was far from stable, and he was not the man he had once been. But it wasn't just about money. There was a psychological component to the relationship between Carol and Stephen that no one had fully understood until now. In their interviews with Carol's friends and family, investigators learned that Carol had often described her ex-husband as controlling and volatile. While he had once been charming, DeMacher's behavior had become erratic after the divorce. There were multiple reports of him showing up uninvited at Carol's house, demanding to be let in to discuss the details of their financial arrangements. Each time, Carol would reluctantly comply, unwilling to escalate the situation. Carol's frustration was also palpable. She had made it clear to her close friends that she had grown tired of the arrangement, the constant financial burden, and the emotional strain of dealing with DeMacher. Yet, Carol seemed trapped, caught between the legal obligations of the divorce and the fear of what DeMacher might do if she refused him. Still, despite all these troubling details, there was nothing concrete to suggest that Stephen DeMacher had anything to do with Carol's disappearance. He was, at least on the surface, a grieving ex-husband who seemed to be spiraling into a personal crisis. But the lack of evidence and the absence of any clear motive kept the investigators from making a decisive move. As the investigation continued, the police broadened their search for clues. They questioned Carol's neighbors, her friends, anyone who might have had any contact with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. They were hoping to uncover something, anything, that might point them in the right direction. What they found was a web of inconsistencies, all of which seemed to circle back to DeMacher. A neighbor who had been one of the last people to see Carol mentioned something curious during her interview. She recalled that Carol had received a strange phone call just a few days before her disappearance. The neighbor hadn't heard the details of the conversation, but she remembered that Carol had seemed agitated after hanging up the phone. Carol had never been one to discuss her private matters openly, but this was different. The neighbor had asked if everything was okay, and Carol had assured her that it was, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. That phone call became a key point in the investigation. The police soon discovered that Carol's phone records revealed a series of calls from DeMacher leading up to her disappearance. The last call, made late the night before, was particularly unsettling. The details of the conversation were unclear, but one thing was certain: it had been heated. Carol had been upset, her voice tinged with frustration and anxiety. The police also uncovered that Carol had been researching ways to legally modify her alimony payments. It was clear that the ongoing financial strain was taking its toll on her. But what was more troubling was the discovery that Carol had been looking into ways to ensure her safety. She had spoken to a lawyer about the possibility of a restraining order against DeMacher, though no formal paperwork had been filed. The detectives were starting to feel the weight of the case bearing down on them. The facts were starting to align, but the question remained: did Stephen DeMacher have the motive to hurt Carol? Had he snapped after years of feeling cornered by the financial obligations of the divorce? Or was there something more to the story that they were missing? The police turned to forensics. They combed through Carol's house, looking for any trace of evidence that might have been overlooked in the initial search. The house itself seemed to hold secrets, secrets that were slowly being uncovered with each passing day. But there was still no sign of Carol, no sign of foul play. As the days stretched on, the police began to uncover more information that raised suspicion about DeMacre's involvement. They discovered that, in the weeks leading up to Carol's disappearance, he had made a number of suspicious inquiries. One of the most startling was his online search history. DeMacre had, on several occasions, searched for terms like how to get away with murder and how to make a death look like an accident. These were chilling discoveries, but still nothing could definitively point to DeMacre as the perpetrator of a crime. There was no body, no direct evidence, just a series of unsettling clues that painted a picture of a man teetering on the edge. The investigation had only just begun to scratch the surface, and as they pieced together the details, the detectives found themselves on the cusp of a revelation, one that would change everything. The first few days after Carol Kennedy's disappearance were filled with confusion, unanswered questions, and growing anxiety. The town of Prescott, Arizona was a quiet place, where everyone knew everyone else, and events like this were rare, if not unheard of. Yet the feeling in the air was thick with tension. In the early hours of the investigation, all eyes seemed to be drawn to one person, Carol's ex-husband, Stephen DeMacre. It wasn't hard to understand why. DeMacre had a history of frustration and volatility. The details of his life, once filled with the success of a well-paid stockbroker career, now seemed to be crumbling. His financial situation was precarious, and his emotions were even more unstable. The divorce, with its emotional and financial toll, had driven a wedge between him and Carol. More than once, friends and acquaintances reported that DeMacre had seemed obsessed with the idea of Carol's alimony payments, and his anger over those obligations had manifested in troubling ways. His life had become a quiet storm, brewing beneath the surface, but without any outward sign of how far he might go to rid himself of the weight he carried. Carol had been the target of his bitterness, his inability to reconcile with the end of their marriage, and the financial burden that came with it. It was clear from the beginning that DeMacre's motives were tied to more than just the alimony. There was a psychological component. Over time, that resentment morphed into something darker, something that could no longer be hidden behind the quiet mask of everyday life. The police began by scrutinizing his movements. They discovered that DeMacre had been in frequent contact with Carol in the days leading up to her disappearance. Calls, texts, and even an unusual visit to her home shortly before she vanished painted a picture of a man who had not fully let go of his ex-wife. A man who, despite their separation, still found ways to insert himself into her life. The visit had occurred just a few days before Carol's disappearance, and it had raised alarm bells. Carol had been upset afterward, her emotional state visibly shaken by what had transpired. According to neighbors, DeMacre had knocked on her door uninvited, demanding to discuss their financial arrangement. This wasn't the first time he had done so, but something about this interaction felt different. There was a sense of urgency, perhaps even desperation, that hadn't been there before. Carol had always been clear in her refusal to revisit the topic, but this time it seemed like she had been pushed to the edge. The day after that visit, Carol's mother spoke to her on the phone. Carol had sounded uneasy, but she assured her mother that everything was fine. That was the last time anyone heard from her. As the investigation continued, the detectives turned to DeMacre's past. They interviewed his friends, his family, anyone who might offer insight into his state of mind. What they found was consistent. DeMacre had been consumed with bitterness over the divorce. However, no one could say for sure if that bitterness had turned into something more dangerous. What everyone could agree on was that his life, and by extension his relationship with Carol, had become a toxic mix of resentment, financial strain, and emotional instability. But even as these pieces began to come together, there was still no concrete evidence to tie DeMacre to Carol's disappearance. No fingerprints, no physical evidence at the scene, no clear motive. It was the ambiguity of the case that made it so frustrating for the detectives. They could not arrest DeMacre on suspicion alone, yet the mounting evidence, both circumstantial and emotional, seemed to point to him. DeMacre was questioned multiple times, but he remained calm. even when the detectives pressed him on the strange timing of his calls and visits to Carol's house. He was dismissive, occasionally cold, but he denied any involvement in her disappearance. There was something unsettling about the way he answered the questions, but nothing that could be used to incriminate him. His answers were carefully measured, too controlled. It was almost as though he had anticipated that his involvement would be suspected and had prepared himself to handle the scrutiny. Meanwhile, the police expanded their investigation. They scoured Carol's home for any sign of forced entry, hoping to find even the smallest clue that would indicate what had happened to her. But there were no signs of a struggle. No broken windows, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest that she had been taken against her will. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, and the house she left behind was a mute witness to her absence. Then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: technology. The police had already started looking into Carol's phone records, but now they focused on DeMacre's digital footprint. In an era when every click, every search, and every message left a trace, the detectives knew they had to check his online activity. What they found was chilling: a search history that included terms like how to get away with murder, how to make a death look like an accident, and methods for killing someone and making it look like a natural death. The detectives were horrified. This wasn't just the idle curiosity of someone who had been going through a tough divorce. This was a clear indication of premeditated thought, an attempt to understand how to commit the ultimate crime and escape without a trace. The search history was damning, but it wasn't definitive proof of guilt. It was, however, another piece of the puzzle, one that pushed the investigation into darker territory. At this point, the detectives were at a crossroads. They had a growing pile of evidence suggesting DeMacre's involvement, but it was all circumstantial. The phone records, the suspicious search history, the motive stemming from his financial situation, none of it could definitively link him to the crime. And without hard evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. Still, the mounting tension between the detectives and DeMacre was palpable. It was clear that he was their prime suspect, but they had to be patient. They had to gather more evidence, something that would leave no room for doubt. For now, they would continue to watch DeMacre, follow his every move, and hope that he would slip up, revealing the truth that seemed just beyond reach. The days stretched on, and as time passed, the case of Carol Kennedy's disappearance became even more tangled. The small town of Prescott, Arizona, had never witnessed a case like this, where suspicion fell so heavily on one individual, yet the evidence remained frustratingly elusive. While many aspects of the investigation pointed towards Stephen DeMacre, there was still no concrete proof to confirm what everyone feared, that he was somehow responsible for his ex-wife's fate. Detectives had spent the better part of the past week gathering information on DeMacre. His movements, his interactions with Carol, and the mounting signs of his emotional instability all painted a picture that was hard to ignore. Still, despite all of this, they had no clear physical evidence tying him to her disappearance. They had a prime suspect, yes, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. As they sifted through DeMacre's background and current life, it became evident that his life had spiraled far beyond the simple frustrations of a broken marriage. His financial situation was dire, and his professional career was nothing like it had been during the peak of his success as a stockbroker. Years of poor decisions and a lack of foresight had left him in a place where his alimony payments to Carol felt like a constant, unbearable weight. What the detectives didn't know yet, and what they couldn't yet prove, was how deeply this financial strain had consumed him, perhaps to the point where he saw no other way out. The evidence against him was piling up, but it still felt like there was something missing. What was it that truly happened in those final moments of Carol's life? Why had she disappeared? Had DeMacre snapped in a moment of desperation? Or was there something even darker behind it all? These were the questions that continued to plague the investigators as they pieced together the fragments of her life and the final days before her vanishing. The breakthrough came in the form of an anonymous tip. It was a call that came into the department one afternoon, a quiet moment that would soon prove to be anything but. The tipster was a former acquaintance of DeMacre's who had worked with him during the height of his career. The person claimed to have overheard a conversation in which DeMacre had spoken openly about his dislike for Carol's ability to move on after the divorce. But it was the final part of the call that caught the investigators' attention. The tipster claimed that DeMacher had mentioned something about being willing to go to extreme lengths to put an end to the financial burden Carol had become. At first, the tip seemed like little more than speculation, the kind of vague claim that could easily be dismissed. But as the investigators dug deeper, they found that the tipster's statement wasn't as far-fetched as they'd initially thought. It seemed to align with the mounting tension in DeMacher's life. He had grown increasingly obsessed with the idea of Carol's alimony payments, and as time went on, he had become more and more agitated. Was it possible that this frustration had escalated to the point where he saw no other option but to silence Carol once and for all? Despite this potential lead, the detectives still couldn't move forward without more substantial evidence. They needed something more concrete, something that would allow them to press charges, to confront DeMacher with the reality of his involvement. It was a game of patience, but the detectives knew that they couldn't afford to let the case slip away. Carol deserved justice, and they were determined to find the answers. Meanwhile, the search for Carol continued. The police expanded their search to neighboring areas, revisiting places Carol had frequented, and speaking to anyone who might have seen her in the days leading up to her disappearance. But even this new search yielded little. Her car remained parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of her, no trail to follow. It was as if Carol had simply vanished. The lack of a body, of any definitive signs of violence, made the case even more complicated. Without these physical signs, it was difficult to prove foul play. The detectives understood that they couldn't simply rely on circumstantial evidence. Something had to give. A crucial piece of the puzzle had to fall into place. As the investigation continued, the detectives began to examine DeMacher's digital footprint more closely. They turned their attention to his phone records, tracking his communication patterns in the days and weeks leading up to Carol's disappearance. What they found was revealing: multiple attempts to contact Carol, some of which had gone unanswered. But more importantly, they discovered a phone call that had taken place in the hours before Carol's disappearance. It was a short, tense conversation that had raised even more questions. DeMacher had been insistent. He needed to speak with Carol, and he needed to do so immediately. The conversation had taken place late at night, and although the exact details of what was said remained unclear, the investigators were certain of one thing: something had changed in that moment. Carol's reaction, or perhaps her refusal to comply with DeMacher's request, seemed to trigger something in him. It was an inflection point, one that the detectives couldn't ignore. But still, without any physical evidence linking DeMacher to Carol's disappearance, they had no choice but to continue the search for more clues. As the investigation entered its third week, the detectives found themselves circling back to the same questions they had started with. What had happened to Carol? Had DeMacher acted alone? Or was there someone else involved? There were so many pieces to the puzzle, but they still couldn't see the full picture. In the meantime, DeMacher, seemingly unaware of how closely the police were monitoring his every move, continued to go about his daily life. He appeared unfazed by the mounting pressure, even as the evidence against him grew. His ability to remain calm, collected, and seemingly unaffected by the situation began to work against him. To the investigators, it was almost as if he was hiding something, or worse, knew something that they didn't. The question of his guilt hung in the air like a dark cloud. The detectives were no longer simply looking for a person to arrest. They were searching for the truth. They needed to know what had truly happened to Carol Kennedy, and they needed to uncover the full extent of DeMacher's involvement in her disappearance. They had their prime suspect, and they knew that they were getting closer. But the final pieces of the puzzle remained frustratingly out of reach. The investigation had only begun to uncover the true depth of the mystery, and the answers, when they came, would not be as simple as anyone had imagined. As the investigation into Carol Kennedy's disappearance entered its fifth week, the sense of frustration among the detectives began to mount. The small town of Prescott, Arizona, had never felt so far removed from the quiet, predictable life it once knew. In the span of just a few weeks, what had started as a simple missing persons case had escalated into something far more complex. Something that threatened to unearth secrets buried beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary life. The detectives had gathered a wealth of circumstantial evidence, but they lacked the one thing they needed most: a smoking gun. With each passing day, the case felt as though it was teetering on the edge of revelation, yet the truth remained frustratingly elusive. And while suspicion continued to build against Stephen DeMacher, no definitive proof had yet been uncovered that could tie him directly to his ex-wife's disappearance. They were close, but not close enough. The previous chapter had seen the police uncover disturbing details about DeMacre's financial situation and his erratic behavior in the months leading up to Carol's disappearance. They had learned of his bitter resentment toward her, stemming from the divorce settlement, and the fact that he had increasingly viewed Carol as an obstacle in his life. The anonymous tip had suggested that DeMacre may have been willing to go to extreme lengths to solve his problems. It seemed to all point to a single, undeniable conclusion. DeMacre had to be involved, but the question remained, to what extent? It wasn't just the financial burden that seemed to drive him. As the detectives delved deeper into DeMacre's personal history, they discovered a man whose world was unraveling in more ways than one. His career had taken a nosedive, his marriage had ended in bitter divorce, and now he found himself constantly under pressure to keep up appearances. DeMacre was a man who had once known success, but that success had quickly slipped through his fingers, leaving behind a shell of the person he once was. The pressure had been building for months, but it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about control. Carol had once been a part of his life, a source of stability, but in his mind, she had become a symbol of everything he had lost. In the quiet moments between the long hours of investigation, the detectives began to wonder whether DeMacre's actions were the result of a cold, calculating mind or a man driven to desperation by his own failings. Was his resentment toward Carol truly about money, or was it something more personal, something darker? The breakthrough came unexpectedly, and it came from a source the detectives had almost forgotten about, the forensic team. Forensic evidence had been something of a missing link in this case. The house where Carol had lived seemed unremarkable, but it was the evidence that they'd gathered from her belongings and the crime scene that would eventually prove to be the key. Upon further analysis, the forensic team found trace evidence that had been overlooked during the initial search. Minute fibers, hair samples, and even fingerprints, none of which belonged to Carol, were discovered in several areas of the house. These traces weren't enough to conclusively prove DeMacre's involvement, but they pointed towards someone who had been inside her home, someone who knew her well. The fibers matched the type of clothing that DeMacre typically wore, and the prints, though partial, appeared to align with his known handprints from previous records. This discovery, though seemingly small, was a significant turning point in the investigation. The evidence was not definitive, but it raised an important question. Could Stephen DeMacre have been inside Carol's house just before she disappeared? And if so, what had happened between them? The timeline began to shift as new information surfaced. The detectives revisited the phone records again, this time with a more focused approach. What they found was even more revealing. DeMacre had made several calls to Carol in the days leading up to her disappearance, and while the content of those calls remained vague, one stood out in particular. On the night before Carol was last seen, DeMacre had made a late-night call to her. The timing of the call raised alarms. Why would he contact her at such an hour, especially after everything that had happened between them? Carol's mother, who had spoken with her just hours before the disappearance, recalled that Carol had been visibly upset after the call from DeMacre. She had confided that DeMacre had insisted on coming over to her house to talk, though Carol had been hesitant. Carol had tried to reassure her mother, but the frustration in her voice was evident. "I'll call you back after he leaves," Carol had said, but that call never came. The detective team now had the final piece of the puzzle. They were certain that something had occurred during that final meeting between Carol and DeMacre, but what exactly had happened was still a mystery. It was clear that the relationship between them had been deteriorating for some time, but now it seemed that something had pushed DeMacre past the point of no return. The animosity, the frustration, and the unresolved feelings that had been building for years seemed to have culminated in one final, tragic moment. The police began to work on a theory, though it was still speculative at this point. What if DeMacre had gone to Carol's house that night after the phone call, and something had gone terribly wrong during their conversation? What if, in a fit of rage or desperation, DeMacre had confronted Carol and escalated the situation into violence? The evidence suggested that something had happened between them that led to her disappearance, but the question was whether it had been premeditated or a crime of passion. The detectives were not yet ready to make an arrest. Despite the mounting evidence against DeMacre, they knew they needed more. They needed to prove that the traces of his presence in Carol's home were not just coincidental. They needed something more, something that would definitively link him to the crime. But with each passing day, it became harder to ignore the weight of the evidence that pointed directly at him. The case had reached a critical juncture. The detectives were now on the cusp of discovering the truth, but they knew that the final step would be the hardest. They would have to confront DeMacher with everything they had gathered: his financial ruin, his psychological breakdown, his obsession with Carol, and the forensic evidence that suggested he had been in her home. It was only a matter of time before the full truth would come to light. The tension that had been building throughout the investigation into Carol Kennedy's disappearance had now reached a breaking point. Weeks had passed since Carol was last seen, and though the police had gathered a significant amount of evidence pointing toward Stephen DeMacher, they still lacked the critical piece to definitively confirm his involvement. It had become a game of patience, strategy, and careful observation. The detectives had been waiting for the one piece of evidence that would allow them to confront DeMacher head-on, to tie him directly to the crime. And it was in the smallest of details, something overlooked at first, that they would find that key to solving the case. For all of his apparent composure, for all the time DeMacher had spent under the watchful eyes of the investigators, he had not acted as a man who was entirely in control of his circumstances. Every move he made, every decision he took, felt calculated, but with an underlying layer of anxiety that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. His alibi, too, had been scrutinized and found wanting. DeMacher had claimed that he was at his home, alone, on the night of Carol's disappearance. But that claim, like so many others, was starting to unravel. The police had already confirmed that he had been in frequent contact with Carol, and the fact that he had shown up uninvited at her house in the days before her disappearance only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. However, there had always been something that gnawed at the edges of the case, a critical detail that had not yet come into focus. As the days turned into weeks, the detectives knew that they had to be methodical, that they could not afford to make any missteps. Carol deserved justice, and the pressure on the investigators to find the truth was immense. Then a breakthrough came from a piece of evidence that had seemed insignificant at first, but with the right focus would soon become pivotal. It was a small, overlooked detail, an inconsistency in DeMacher's own account of the night Carol disappeared. As detectives reviewed the forensic reports, something stood out in the analysis of the fibers and hair samples collected from Carol's home. A particular type of fiber was discovered on Carol's clothing, a fiber that matched the fabric of a coat DeMacher had worn on several occasions. When DeMacher was questioned about this, he dismissed it as a coincidence, stating that the two had shared a history of being in close proximity to one another, but the detectives weren't convinced. Forensic experts who had been meticulously studying the samples discovered that the fiber found on Carol's clothing did not match anything in the general environment of the house. There were no traces of this particular fabric anywhere else in the house, suggesting that this fiber had come from someone who had been in very close proximity to Carol. The evidence was becoming irrefutable. DeMacher had been in Carol's home on the night she disappeared. The detectives, now certain that they had the evidence they needed, began to trace DeMacher's movements in greater detail. It was as if the web surrounding him had started to unravel completely. With a newfound sense of clarity, the police reviewed the security footage from the night Carol vanished. They had previously overlooked it, but this time they watched it with a sharper eye. The footage, taken from a nearby camera, showed DeMacher's car parked near Carol's house around the time she was last heard from. The timing matched up with the phone call Carol had received from him late that night. The confirmation that DeMacher had been nearby was crucial. His attempts to downplay his involvement, to feign innocence, had not worked. The detectives were now facing the crucial task of piecing together the final moments of Carol's life. They knew that something had happened during that phone call, that Carol had been hesitant to let DeMacher into her life once again, yet she had done so. Had he forced his way into her home? Had an argument turned violent? With all the pieces now in place, the detectives began to reconstruct the night of Carol's disappearance, relying on everything they had gathered from phone records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. The timeline was beginning to make sense. Carol's last communication had been with her mother, when she had spoken about a confrontation with DeMacher. She had been upset, her voice shaky as she explained that she was trying to resolve the issue with him. Yet, after that conversation, she was never heard from again. The next morning, her car was still parked outside, and her phone had been left behind. It was as though Carol had disappeared in an instant, without warning. As the investigation reached its climax, the detectives had no choice but to confront DeMacher with the mounting evidence. They knew they were running out of time. The pieces of the puzzle were all pointing in his direction. What they needed now was a confession, a definitive answer to the question that had haunted them for weeks. Did Stephen DeMacher murder Carol Kennedy? It was time to put everything on the table. DeMacher was called in for questioning again, this time with all the evidence they had gathered. His previous statements were now in direct contradiction with the new findings. The fibers, the security footage, the phone records, it was all too much to dismiss. DeMacher remained calm, though, denying everything. His stoic demeanor seemed to suggest that he had rehearsed his answers, that he was prepared for the barrage of evidence coming his way. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the detectives could sense the growing cracks in his story. There was no denying it now. DeMacher was responsible for Carol's disappearance. But the question remained, what had motivated him to take that final step? Was it a crime of passion? Was it the pressure of the financial burden he faced? Or was it something deeper, more personal, that had been festering for years? The detectives knew that they were on the verge of uncovering the full truth. The next step was clear. They had to bring DeMacher to trial. And finally, the justice that Carol Kennedy deserved could begin to unfold. The room was quiet, too quiet for the weight that hung in the air. The detectives had spent weeks chasing leads, gathering evidence, and building their case against Stephen DeMacher. Now, it was time for the final confrontation. Carol Kennedy, a woman whose life had been violently interrupted, deserved justice. The truth that had remained so elusive was finally within their grasp. All they needed now was for DeMacher to admit what they already knew, that he had been involved in Carol's disappearance. But getting him to confess would require more than just evidence. It would require a confrontation that forced him to face the magnitude of his actions. Stephen DeMacher sat across from the detectives, his posture stiff and formal. He had been cooperative, if not cold, during the course of the investigation, providing answers that seemed rehearsed, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that gave him away. He knew the net was closing in, but he wasn't about to make it easy for them. Detective Harris, who had been leading the investigation, began the questioning. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an underlying edge to it. It was the tone of someone who knew the answer to the question before it was even asked. The detectives placed a series of photographs on the table, one by one. A close-up of the fibers found on Carol's clothing, fibers that matched DeMacher's jacket. The partial fingerprints recovered from her home, fingerprints that, when matched, pointed directly to him. And perhaps most damning of all, the security footage showing his car parked near Carol's house the night she disappeared. DeMacher didn't flinch when he saw the photos. He had been expecting this moment. His eyes narrowed and he sat a little straighter, though his hands remained folded neatly in front of him. "You know why we're here, don't you, Stephen?" Detective Harris asked. "You know why these pieces of evidence have led us to you?" DeMacher's jaw tightened. He remained silent for a long moment, staring at the photographs before him. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, but it wasn't uncomfortable, not for the detectives. It was a calculated pause, a moment of pressure, one that would either make him crack or cause him to double down on his defense. "I don't know what you think you have," DeMacher finally said, his voice calm but edged with annoyance. "I was never in her house. These are just coincidences. You have nothing." Harris leaned forward, eyes fixed on DeMacher. "It's not a coincidence, Stephen. The fibers found on Carol's clothing match your jacket. We know you've been in her home. We have footage of your car outside her house on the night she disappeared. We know you've been making calls to her, and not just a few, daily calls, sometimes several times a day. Your behavior wasn't just obsessive. It was controlling. You couldn't let her go, could you?" DeMacher's face tightened, but he didn't speak. The detectives let the silence hang in the air for a few more moments, knowing that the longer it lasted, the more pressure it put on him. "I'm not here to make accusations," Harris continued, his voice softening slightly. "I'm here because I want to understand what happened that night. I want to know what went wrong. Why, after everything, after the divorce, the alimony, the anger, did you go to her house?" DeMacher's gaze flickered briefly to the window, as if searching for an answer in the night outside. But then, with a slight shake of his head, he looked back at the detectives, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't kill her," DeMacher said, his voice shaking slightly, the calm front starting to crack. "I didn't do anything to her. She just..." Disappeared. I don't know what happened. But the detectives weren't convinced. They had seen this before. The denial, the refusal to acknowledge what was clear. And in that moment, Detective Harris knew that the truth was right there in front of him, hidden beneath the layers of resentment and frustration that DeMacher had carefully built over the years. "Stephen," Harris said, his voice calm but firm, "the truth is that Carol's death wasn't a random act. It wasn't something that just happened by accident. She was the victim of someone who was emotionally drained, financially strapped, and unable to accept the end of a relationship. Someone who was unwilling to let go of their past." DeMacher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes flickered with something. Maybe regret, maybe guilt, but he still wouldn't admit it. "You don't understand," DeMacher said, his voice rising. "She kept coming back into my life, talking about the alimony, about everything. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't let her keep controlling me. She was going to ruin me. You don't know how it feels to lose everything, to be stuck paying for something that's already gone. I thought it was over. But then she kept coming back, demanding more, pushing more. I couldn't take it." Detective Harris nodded slowly, recognizing the underlying truth in DeMacher's words. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control, about a need to dominate, to exert power over a situation that he couldn't let go of. "You went to her house that night, didn't you?" Harris pressed. "You confronted her. You couldn't stand the idea that she was going to keep making demands. Something happened in that moment, didn't it? Something snapped. She wouldn't give you what you wanted, and you couldn't accept it. You took it too far." DeMacher's face twisted with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't know what it's like," he shouted. "You don't understand what she did to me, what she kept doing to me. She had to be stopped. I had to stop her." For a moment, the detectives watched as DeMacher's anger flared, but they remained calm. The confession was slowly taking shape, not in one clean sentence, but in the way he described the escalating tension, the desperation that had driven him to that moment. The rage, the need to exert control over Carol's life was becoming clearer. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. A new development was unfolding. DeMacher's legal team had arrived. They had clearly been watching from behind the scenes, ready to put up a defense once things escalated. The detectives were given a few moments of silence as the lawyers huddled with DeMacher. But the cat was out of the bag. The detectives knew what had happened. They knew that DeMacher had been driven to a breaking point, pushed by his financial troubles, his need for control, and his inability to move on. He had taken that final, irreversible step, and Carol Kennedy had paid the price. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation as the trial of Stephen DeMacher finally began. The case had garnered national attention, not only because of the gruesome details that had unfolded, but also because it had struck a nerve with the public. The tragic tale of a woman whose life was violently stolen from her by someone who had once promised to love her, only to let greed and obsession take over. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Laura Matthews, had a clear and compelling case. They had meticulously pieced together the timeline of events, connecting the dots between the evidence found at Carol Kennedy's home, the surveillance footage that showed DeMacher's car outside her residence, and the damning forensic evidence that pointed to his involvement. The emotional strain, the financial burden, and the overwhelming control he sought over his ex-wife were woven into the narrative Matthews presented to the jury. She opened her argument by describing the life Carol Kennedy had been forced to endure in the years after her divorce. She'd been a victim of not just financial strain, but of constant psychological torment. Matthews spoke about the constant calls and visits from DeMacher, his increasingly erratic behavior, and the toll it took on Carol. Matthews also detailed the heartbreaking final moments of Carol's life, the phone call with her mother, the hesitation she felt when DeMacher arrived at her door. This, the prosecutor emphasized, was not a random act of violence. It was the culmination of months, if not years, of emotional and psychological abuse. For the defense, it was clear that they had little to work with. DeMacher's own defense attorney, Henry Sullivan, had one job: to create doubt. But as the trial unfolded, Sullivan's case seemed flimsy at best. He argued that there was no concrete proof DeMacher had killed Carol. Yes, the evidence pointed to his presence at her home, but there was no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no direct confession. Sullivan attempted to suggest that Carol could have been involved in her own disappearance, that she had run off for some reason or another, and that the circumstances were merely coincidental. But this argument never gained much traction. The prosecution's case was too airtight. The fibers found on Carol's clothing matched DeMacre's jacket. The phone records painted a picture of a man obsessively trying to maintain control over his ex-wife. And most damning of all, DeMacre's own words, uttered in the heat of the interrogation room, confirmed the growing tension that had led to his eventual breakdown. As the days wore on and the witnesses testified, the weight of the trial seemed to bear down heavily on everyone in the room. The emotional toll on Carol's family was evident. Her mother, once a pillar of strength, struggled to hold back tears as she recalled the last conversation she had with her daughter. The courtroom was silent as she spoke about Carol's fears and the strain she had endured. For every piece of evidence presented, it seemed that another layer of the tragedy was revealed. But it was DeMacre's own testimony that perhaps had the most powerful impact on the jury. When he finally took the stand, his calm demeanor, once an asset, seemed increasingly hollow. His defense was simple. He had not killed Carol. He could not explain the fibers or the fingerprints. He had no explanation for the phone calls or the surveillance footage. All he could offer was that he was simply a man who had been overwhelmed by his circumstances, his financial troubles, his inability to cope with the end of his marriage, and that it was a tragic misunderstanding. But as the prosecutor cross-examined him, it became clear that his words were nothing more than a weak attempt to deflect responsibility. His anger, his control issues, and his unrelenting desire to dominate Carol had ultimately led to the unthinkable. And it was in that moment, when the jury saw through his carefully constructed facade, that the truth finally became impossible to ignore. After weeks of testimony and legal wrangling, the jury retired to deliberate. It was an agonizing wait. For Carol's family, every moment felt like an eternity. Her mother and friends sat together, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a long, painful ordeal. The truth was within reach, but they had to wait for the final decision that would bring them closure. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell into an almost unbearable silence. The foreman stood, and the judge motioned for him to speak. The verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder. It was a moment of mixed emotions. Carol's family let out sighs of relief, but they were not joyful. They had waited for justice for so long, and now that it had arrived, it didn't erase the loss they had suffered. There was no real sense of victory, just the quiet understanding that the man who had taken Carol's life would now pay for his actions. As DeMacre was led away in handcuffs, his face devoid of expression, the weight of the crime that had shattered a family began to settle over the courtroom. The legal process had run its course, but the emotional impact of what had transpired was far from over. The aftermath of the trial was not one of celebration. Carol Kennedy's family, her mother, her children, and her friends, were left to pick up the pieces of a life torn apart by violence. The conviction of Stephen DeMacre brought closure, but it also opened up a floodgate of emotions. For her family, the trial had been an agonizing reminder of the woman they had lost. No verdict could bring her back. Carol's mother, who had been a quiet, resilient figure throughout the investigation, found herself grappling with new emotions. There was a strange sense of emptiness in her heart, a feeling that the justice they had fought so hard for didn't truly fill the void left by her daughter's absence. She often reflected on the conversations they had shared, the moments of reassurance Carol had given her, only to have everything ripped away in an instant. The case had also stirred something in the community. Prescott, once a town that had always felt safe and predictable, had now been shaken to its core. The tragedy of Carol's life, and her untimely death, had sparked conversations about domestic violence, financial abuse, and the dangerous power dynamics that can develop in relationships. It was a grim reminder that what appeared to be a stable life on the outside could often be hiding something much darker. For the detectives, the conclusion of the case marked the end of a long, exhausting journey. But even though they had brought the truth to light, they knew that they had only uncovered a small part of the real emotional impact. The psychological toll of a crime like this was far-reaching, and even as they moved on to other cases, they carried the weight of Carol's story with them. Stephen DeMacre's conviction brought the closure that was so desperately needed, but it didn't erase the years of emotional damage he had inflicted. His sentencing would be the final chapter in a case that had torn through the lives of everyone involved. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.